I would like to welcome you to the Racial Justice Plenary Session of the Northwest Justice Summit. I'm John Hilke from the Woodinville UU Church, and I serve as Treasurer of JUUstice Washington. Thank you for joining us for the 10th Summit. I'm delighted and honored to be introducing our panelists today, Reverend Carlton Smith, Aisha Hauser, and Reverend Michael Crumpler. Before I get to that, however, I have a few reminders to briefly cover. This material was sent to you on Friday in an afternoon email as well, so hopefully it will sound familiar. After our panelists finish their presentations, there'll be a 20-minute question and answer opportunity. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to type your questions to Tech Q&A. Sahar or Larkin, our interns, will aggregate and sort the questions and give them to the panelists. Try to send your questions as they occur to you rather than clumping them at the end of the panel presentations. After the Q&A, we'll divide into breakout rooms. Sahar or Larkin will read the questions that we hope you will address during these small groups. Toward the end of that session, someone from your breakout group should use the chat to provide a few summary sentences about your breakout group. As in all UU meetings, we ask you to honor the UU 7 principles and be respectful of others. As we prepare to hear from our panelists, we again acknowledge that most of us live in the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples. Our Zoom techs for this morning will be Sahar or Larkin and Doug. So much gratitude to them for their help in this meeting. Now for the introductions. Hopefully everyone will be present and we'll be able to go forward with that. Reverend Carlton E. Smith is the regional lead for the Pacific Western region, just recently appointed. From 2013 to 2020, he was a member of the UA Congregational Life Staff group serving the southern region. And before that, he was a parish minister serving UU congregations in Metro New York, Greater Boston, Northern Virginia, and Oakland, California. Reverend Smith graduated from Howard University School of Business and its School of Divinity. He's been a candidate for US Congress and for the state Senate, both in his home state of Mississippi. Reverend Smith was a founding member of the Organizing Collective for Black Lives of Unitarian Universalists. He currently serves as a board member of the Living Legacy Project and is a member of the campaign board for the LGBTQ Victory Fund. Aisha Hauser is the president of the Liberal Religious Educators Association. Aisha is an accomplished religious educator and curriculum developer, facilitator, author of anti-racism advocate, and is currently serving our faith as one of the lead ministry team for the Church of the Larger Fellowship. While Aisha started her professional career in the field of social work after earning an MSW from Hunter College in New York City, she quickly became involved in the religious education program at the first Unitarian Universalist congregation she attended, and there found her love for religious education. Her experience includes serving 3 UU congregations on both coasts and working for the Unitarian Universalist Association, serving as the Children and Family Program Director. Reverend Michael Crumpler is the LGBTQ and Multicultural Programs Director at the Unitarian Universalist Association. Reverend Crumpler is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. Michael lives in Harlem and is very active in social justice ministry at the historic Judson Memorial Church in New York, where he served as the president of the board from 2016 to 18. He's most passionate about intersectional ministry centered on Blackness, queerness, HIV, AIDS, economic justice, and emotional well-being. So if we're ready to go, Reverend Smith, you're on.
John, thank you so much. And I'm going to set my stopwatch now just so that I make sure that I do everything. In 20 minutes, right? That's what we got.
20 minutes, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm setting it for 19, so it'll give me like 1 minute to spare at the end. What a treat to be with you all and to have my colleagues, Aisha Hauser and Reverend Michael Crumpler with me or as part of this panel. What an honor and privilege to be with you all of JUUstice of Washington. Thank you so much for inviting me. John, thank you for that generous introduction. And this opportunity to share insights and reflections and to hopefully provide a little bit of context for the work that we are doing as Unitarian Universalists in the Pacific Western region and in the Pacific Northwest. As I was putting my thoughts together, I put together like a few slides, and hopefully this will be helpful and it will facilitate a bit. I'm hoping I've got the capacity to screen share. I bet I do. Maybe I do. It's awesome. Thank you, screen share people, all our tech people. Appreciate you all. All right. So I would start with a thought about location. I was once in real estate in the Boston area for a year. I under-earned in real estate for a year. I made one sale during the whole year. But I did come to appreciate in that year the idea of location, location, location. And part of what I believe that we do in our religious settings is offer each other a sense of location in terms of like where our spiritual compass lies, where we lie in terms of our social references, in terms of who we are and what we're seeking to bring to the world, historical references in terms of time spans as well. And while General Assembly was in St. Louis in 2006, I had a chance to visit the Gateway Arch. I hadn't seen it since I was a very young child, and my family was traveling across the West for vacation one year. And there's a quote in the Museum of the Westward Expansion from Eliel Saarinen, who's the father of Eero Saarinen, the designer of the Gateway Arch. And I'm sharing that with you now. That quote went like this: "Always design a thing by considering it in its next larger context. A chair in a room in a house in an environment, and an environment in a city plan." So to locate myself a little bit, I'm a Southerner, born and bred Mississippian, living in a land that was originally occupied by the Chickasaw Nation. I identify as Black African American. I am a member of the LGBTQ community. I've been a Unitarian Universalist minister for 25 years, though I have deep roots in the Black United Methodist tradition, as well as Black Pentecostalism through the Church of God in Christ on my parents' side of the family. Again, I'm a graduate of an HBCU twice, Howard University. Go Bison, go Kamala Harris, who was one of my classmates. I was a childhood comic book and Greek mythology lover. So when I look back, it's no wonder that I ended up sort of like as a social justice warrior, as a Unitarian Universalist minister. And I'm a student of history, especially US civil rights history. I wanted to say something about things operating in the background. So here we have a lovely home, someone's residence, we can presume. Very well manicured, very well presented, and there's all sorts of things that are going on in the background that we want to acknowledge as well. So for example, we don't think about it when we look at a house like this necessarily, but you've got the washer and dryer, you've got the whole plumbing system going on in the background that you don't necessarily see when you look at the front of it. There's an air conditioning system somewhere, we can presume, that helps keep the house cool and operating at a comfortable level. Then there's also someone who's coming and doing the maintenance of the lawn and keeping the yard as beautiful as we see it presented here. And I thought it was important to talk about this because a lot of the work that we do on the regional level in Unitarian Universalism is operating in the background. So sometimes we gather together to make a public presentation of our faith, as with the Side with Love campaign represented by these wonderful young people that we see represented here. We'll be out in the public sphere in a protest, at an action. And it's wonderful to have that in the foreground, and in the background, what's going on? Well, let's look to see. Oh, on Sunday morning, there's going to be a Unitarian Universalist choir somewhere. I think this is from our congregation in Santa Rosa. I was just snatching images off the web, as you could imagine one does for such a presentation. So there's someone who's providing musical inspiration somewhere. You can be pretty sure that there is a board meeting. I think this is the congregation in Walnut Creek, if I'm not mistaken, doing an online board meeting. So there's someone in the background doing that kind of work. And you can imagine there's a religious education program going somewhere in our Unitarian Universalist building, someone that's working with our young people, such as the young people that we see here, who were raised on Unitarian Universalist values. So in addition to what we see in the foreground, we also want to acknowledge and affirm all the work that's going on in the background that makes the foreground of our social justice work possible. So now I would say a word about what social justice looks like for me personally, and I've got this list of things here. It looks like having attended an HBCU, historically Black college and university, when there was the option of going to predominantly white institutions, including Ole Miss, which is just a stone's throw from where I am here in North Mississippi, my hometown at the moment. Marching in the clergy counter protest at Charlottesville. Addressing racial matters in the moment. So that's to say, if I'm doing some workshop or program and there's something that comes up that doesn't feel right, rather than sort of stepping over it, I will actually hopefully use it as a learning opportunity. People aren't always excited or happy about that, but I do it nonetheless. It looks like supporting colleagues and coworkers and lay leaders of color is part of the racial justice work that I do. Tending to my own care and nurture, that includes taking a nap sometimes. I mean, there's some days, and I think that there might be even people on this call who relate to this, where whatever it is that's being flashed on the screen on the nightly news is just too much. I'm just thinking back to when I first saw the killing of Eric Garner on Staten Island. I was in bed for 2 days behind that. It was just more than I could take. Sometimes it looks like getting out of bed, once that period of recovery or recuperation might be over with. Tending to the care and nurture of other Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other marginalized groups. Running for office, that's what racial justice looks like. I'm here in Mississippi, where Ida B. Wells Barnett is my home person. She actually went to the college where my parents met, Russ College, back in the 19th century. Tremendous leader there. I think about Fannie Lou Hamer, all of these historical figures that I have to draw upon, allowing white colleagues and allies into my thinking so that they can benefit from my perspective and view, and I provide that. Coming out of minimization, and for those of you who might not be familiar with that terminology, minimization is where we try to flatten out our differences and pretend like we're all on the same page at all times and under all circumstances, and playing down our different perspectives and opinions and values. But to come out of minimization means to take a risk and also encourage everyone else to do the same. So when I come out of minimization, I realized this when I was working on the Southern Region team, it helps all of the staff to expand as well, because when I'm not sitting on my differences or what makes me unique, that encourages everyone else to be more honest with the whole group as well. So I think that when we're able to present our true and authentic selves, we help increase the capacity of all the systems that we operate within. It looks like pledging financially to Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizations. Again, it's taking the risk of being a member of the organizing collective for Black Lives of UU when it was getting started 5 years ago. There were many cases to be made for me not choosing to do that as a member of the UUA staff at the time. But trying to walk that tightrope was a stressful thing. But I'm grateful that I was able to do that at the time, and there's been benefit to the association from the work that those of us who are part of that together were doing. And also being on the board for the Living Legacy Project, which offers, well, in the past, before we were in a pandemic, offered tours and pilgrimages actually to civil rights memorial sites throughout the South, especially in my home state of Mississippi and in Alabama. A bit more context for you. The 4 C's are sort of guiding principles that we have for congregational life staff across the nation. And are for the regions that we have are, of course, Pacific Western region, Central East region, New England region, Mid-America region, and Southern region. The 4 C's actually originated in the Southern region with Natalie Briscoe, who's now one of my colleagues. She's the co-lead for the Southern region. And these are ideas that we wrap our minds around when we're trying to identify the work that we're seeking to do as regional congregational life staff. And they are these: that we seek to challenge congregational leaders to help their congregations become the most vital congregations that each can become. We coach congregational leaders through consultation and trainings. We companion congregations through times of difficulty and times of celebration. And so this looks like, especially for those of us in the Pacific Western region, being with you all as you're moving through the circumstances around the fires that are affecting you, as well as the uprisings that are happening in the cities and the protests, as well as being present for ordinations, installations, and connecting congregational leaders to one another, to institutional partners, and to resources. And so these are all the 4 C's that we work with. So now just a word on what racial justice looks like for the PWR. Again, some of this operating in the background and some of it in the foreground. So we work with congregations that are divided over AR, AOMC issues. That's anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multicultural issues. And we're no stranger to that, or say you're no stranger to that in the Pacific Northwest. We encourage congregations towards generosity and stewardship. And sometimes that looks like supporting UU affiliated organizations or inclusive organizations such as Black Lives of UU or DRUM, Diverse Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries. Affirming the fundamental differences between in being a Black, Indigenous, or person of color within Unitarian Universalism. And that's just to say that, that there is something, there's a distinct expectation and distinct challenges that, that Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience inside of Unitarian Universalism that's over and above just the general expectations of someone who's serving as an administrator, minister, board president, religious educator, that musician, that's different from what our white counterparts are actually dealing with, challenging congregations to do better in relationship to the people of color that are part of those communities. This also includes just looking at the materials and resources that we have available and looking to see if they actually represent the diversity of our movement, of our nation, and of our region. Being dedicated listeners and advisors for white colleagues and lay leaders. There are conversations, I would venture to say, that Aisha and Michael and I have that probably some of you who might identify as white never have to experience or deal with, because we just by showing up, we present an opportunity for people to ask questions that they might not ask under other circumstances. Bridging between the Commission on Institutional Change report and actual congregational life. Some of you might be aware that the study guide for the COIC report just came out this week. And so now we're just on the front ends of figuring out how we're going to support the districts inside the Pacific Western region in actually making the report accessible to members of the congregation, and how we as a regional staff as well as the district boards are going to be working through that as well. Bringing an AR/AOMC lens to our daily work inside of congregational life, which also includes incorporating and centering stories and ideas of AR/AOMC into our content as we share that is with the congregations that we're working with, and accompanying UUs at local protest for racial justice when we can. So my classic example of that would be having been part of the clergy counter protest at Charlottesville in 2017, along with Dr. Cornell West and several Unitarian Universalists who were part of that, including our president of the UUA, Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray. And also, when I was in Southern Region, also working with Reverend Barber and his Moral Mondays protest as well, and the annual gatherings that he would have in Raleigh to speak out against racial injustice. Backing larger initiatives that affect Black, Indigenous, and people of color, such as UU the Vote and immigration as a moral issue, back when we had a huge focus on that around 2010, 11, and 12. In general, building relationships of trust and accountability, which provides the framework in which we can have some of these more difficult conversations about sensitive topics such as race and racial identity. And also hiring staff that reflects the diversity of our nation and of the region and our Unitarian Universalist movement. And at the moment, of the 10 full-time staff and 1 part-time staff in the Pacific Western region of our UUA, we now have 3 of us who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And I think that's probably the highest percentage that the region has had. And I think that actually supports our work as we are committed to reflecting that and being visionaries and ambassadors to the world and participating in this great experiment that we know as Unitarian Universalism. Wow, I did that pretty good. I got 3 minutes left. So what's your preference, John? Should I answer questions? Do you want to give that time to Aisha so she can take 23 minutes?
Yes. That's great. If we can make up a little time, that would be wonderful. So,
all right,
yeah.
I'm
Thanks
done.
so much.
So I take it I'm next.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Carlton. That was amazing. I don't have a PowerPoint. You're just going to hear me speak. I'm actually going to move my computer because I don't want the window to, I have a stand on my dining room table. So I'm going to start with a couple of quotes, one by Audre Lorde, Black queer activist poet. For we have built into all of us old blueprints of expectations and response, old structures of oppression, and these must be altered at the same time as we alter the living conditions which are a result of those structures. The second quote I want to read is from Sandra Bass, and it's excerpted from a book called Endangered Species, Enduring Values. It's an anthology of San Francisco area writers and artists of color. Now is the time to unleash our collective imaginations, to till the soil, nourish the seeds of change with our aspirations, and bolster fledgling shoots promising new possibilities with ageless wisdoms, compassion, and courage. Not because we're certain that our labors will bear a harvest, but because we know that it is only through daily acts of loving and serving with and for each other that we live into our boundless, sacred humanity. Constant gardeners we must be, ever preparing the earth for full and abundant life. So when we talk about how we are in our congregations, whether they are brick or mortar or the congregation I now currently am co-leading, the Church of Larger Fellowship, the Congregation Without Walls, although 1,200 of our incarcerated UUs are very much living not only in walls, but in cages. We need to expand our imaginations of how we need to be in community. So we not only live out our Unitarian Universalist values, but we remember that we're here as humans to care for each other. So one of the things I want to start with to dispel, and it's been a pet peeve of mine for quite a while, and probably since the teach-in, the spring of our enlightenment, to quote our colleague Jessica York, there are some who really love to argue this notion of logic and reason. Here's the thing with that I want to just put out there. If reason and logic were the way the human brains, if we led with that, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in right now as human beings. Climate change, we've known about for a very, very long time, even before Al Gore. So if we were reasonable, logical humans, we would have done immediately what we needed to do, right? if we were logical, we wouldn't have people living on the street. I live in Seattle, where I've seen $400,000 cars drive by me. I only know that because my son is into them. I am not. And we have people living, that same car is driving by hundreds of people living in a street. So logic and reason is not our default as human beings. So here comes religion, and we're trying to make meaning, right? Religion, life becomes religious whenever we make it so. Sophia Leinfaz said that. So I want to put aside this idea that logic and reason in any way we lead with. So then what do? We lead with when we're in a place of fear, when we don't have our needs met, and we go to anxiety. I know there's been kind of we've been part of what Cecilia Kingman called a slow moving trauma since March. For many, for Black and Indigenous folks, for hundreds of years, for generations, this trauma, this anxiety, this uncertainty. So we as people of faith, as people of the Unitarian Universalist faith, we say we want to make the world a place. We have these 7 principles. On paper, we're pretty cool. On paper, oh, okay, we could get behind this. We can get behind equality, justice, the arc bending, LGBTQ rights. But then when we get together, all of a sudden, social justice becomes an intellectual exercise. And that's what needs to stop right now. We don't have that luxury. We've never had it. We certainly do not have it now when we have fascism breathing down our necks, and the world just seems to be crumbling around us. So expanding our imaginations beyond where it is right now. We don't know what's going to happen with this election. We really don't. People lie to pollsters all the time. So I'm not taking anything for granted. What I do know is, even if we vote out the current regime, we still have a mess. This is still a messy world, right? So where do our congregations come in? I want to lift up Louisville. So for those of you who have not been paying attention to what's been happening in Louisville, I suggest Googling not only the protests, but there's been articles written about the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Louisville that housed protesters. They were surrounded by police. I am so sorry. Shit! I have 2 dogs that don't care that I'm in a summit. I'm gonna just move them. I'm so sorry, hold on. Sorry. So my husband's gonna take them out. So where was I? Louisville. So we are going to be asked in the coming years, especially if this regime stays, right, to put ourselves in positions that are going to harken back to the civil rights era. Depending on how bad this gets, we could be hearkening to Nazi Germany. We don't know. And so I think there are some UUs who genuinely can't even imagine how bad it can get. And not to be, Miss Gloom and Doom, but we need to imagine that we are going to be asked to make some really hard choices. And that includes not being comfortable. None of this is comfortable. None of us should be sitting in comfort right now because the world is that bad. There are still babies in cages. Like when every now and then I'll just be living my life and I'm like, there are babies in cages and I'm having a bagel for breakfast and there's children without their families for no other reason than we are a country who thinks this is okay. Again, if logic and reason led, there would not be babies in cages. So practically speaking, one of the things that I would invite our congregations to do is, and I think some have done this around the country, find out the history of place. So not only we are in the Coast Salish land, specifically where the Duwamish land, but also when one time I was at a GA and somebody said, well, what if my entire congregation is all white? Which we're not going to go down that rabbit hole, but I question that. But let's say it is. It didn't get there neutrally. There is no all European space in North or South America or Central America that happened neutrally. It happened through displacement, genocide, laws, redlining, Google sundown law, sundown towns. And so find out how your area, where your congregation is. And then this is the other thing. How many of our congregations are even located in places where you could protect protesters? We have way too many of our congregations in comfortable suburban neighborhoods where you're never going to have to worry about having to protect protesters from police because there aren't going to be protesters there. So that's something to think about as well. So how can you utilize those buildings as places of safety or places people can gather if needed? And what does it mean to follow? What are ways that UU congregations can genuinely take direction from activists, Black leaders, Indigenous leaders, immigrant leaders? Because that's a skill that I don't know a lot of UUs are really good at. So learn, we need, humility is a great thing. Maybe our 9th principle, I know Paul Cole Jones is working on the 8th principle. Maybe our 9th one can be humility. I don't know where we are with time, John. I just should have done my my phone and I didn't. So I'm just going to keep going.
15 minutes. Keep going.
Okay, 15. So I'm going to set my phone. Okay, good. I'm just going to set my phone because my dog's kind of.
We also have a timekeeper. We just.
Oh, good. Oh, excellent. 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 And the other thing is learn to have difficult conversations. We're not going to dismantle systems of oppression in comfort at all. It's uncomfortable. Now, when I say difficult conversations, it's okay to be sad and feel kind of the weight of the horrors of this country. This is not to make anyone, it's not about feeling guilty at all. I mean, I'm an immigrant. I was born in Egypt. I could easily say, oh, nobody in my family owned slaves. Well, we were also colonized by the British and we have hella anti-Blackness in Egypt. So what's the point of that? We still need to fix the current broken world, right? And I haven't yet read Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, but somebody said that her metaphor was, if you buy a house and that house has a rotten foundation and there's mold in the walls and there's all kinds of things wrong with the house, you're not going to live in that house until you fix it. That's the point. The United States right now is on a rotten foundation built on blood and genocide. The walls are moldy. We have a rotten orange pumpkin sitting in the middle of our living room, right? So we need to fix that in order to live in it with clean water, with clean air, with our neighbors, where we can feed each other. The other thing I want to name when we're in our congregations is our children and youth and visitors and people who aren't already part of our community are watching everything we do and say. So when someone walks in, a visitor, and they hear people arguing about Black Lives Matter, or why do we, or arguing about what do we mean by defund the police? Why are you saying that? Or arguing instead of from a place of curiosity. Well, wait, what does it mean to defund the police? Oh, well, here's the larger holistic picture about that. What does it mean to affirm Black Lives Matter? Because I promise you, when I left the brick and mortar congregation, East Shore Unitarian Church, where I was for 7 years, people were still asking that. People were still upset that we had signs up. I mean, it shifted a lot. There's a lot less people, but it hasn't gone away altogether. So inviting people into conversations from a place of curiosity and having a center. Have a center. I had a board president say to me once, we don't want to upset Trump voters. And I said, here's my thing with that. I don't have Trump voters in my mind when I do anything at all. Those people have to live with themselves and their own conscience. What I center is humanity, is people who've been targeted, and how do I work to center their needs, the needs of people who've been literally murdered. A 12-year-old was murdered sitting on a swing, Tamir Rice. I think about him too. My son was not much older than him when that happened. So if I'm presenting a sermon or a story and I offend someone in the congregation because they support Trump and I said something that's not, I would say, well, if my value of not wanting to cage or kill children because they are Black and brown, offend you, then that is something you need to consider for yourself why it doesn't offend you. So this idea in Unitarian Universalism that we have to not upset people has not served Unitarian Universalism. It hasn't served the people, and we're not even a religion. Then we're just a club. And we need to be a faith community, because the world needs a faith community that doesn't just center, biblical stories as fact from thousands of years ago. We're trying to figure out why we're here, how to move forward. So let's be better people and work together, rather than have these, frankly, absurd conversations that don't fix anything, that don't move us forward, that don't expand our imaginations. They frankly keep us stuck. So let us not be stuck. Let us look for ways to provide food. What if every single one of our 1,000+ brick and mortar congregations had a food bank? What if every single one of our congregations offered some kind of tutoring assistance? What if, if we're going to expand our imaginations, let's expand them, right? Let's think big. Why not? Because guess what? The people who cause harm thought it was a great idea to cage children, and they made that happen, and there's billions of dollars going to it. So why not expand our imaginations for something that will help and bring something good in the world? So I'm going to leave it there, and we'll have extra time for questions, and I do better with it back and forth anyway. So thank you. Sorry about my dogs.
Wow. John, you set this up wonderfully. So I've never followed Carlton and Aisha before, but we're going to do it today. It's great to be here. I'm honored to have been asked to be a part of this summit and a part of this amazing panel that is a lot. 20 minutes from each of us, I knew it would be a lot. But I am the Reverend Michael Crumpler, the LGBTQ and Multicultural Programs Director at the UUA. And as John named, I live in New York City. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I live in New York City now, but I've lived in many other places. I've spent most of my adult life at this point. New York is a contender soon, but most of my adult life has been in Chicago. I was born and raised in North Carolina. At about, junior high, we moved to North Jersey, not too far outside of New York City. So I have a lot of geography in my blood. In addition, I have a lot of faith as well. I've been on all corners of Christendom. I've been born and raised in the Black church. In my 20s, when I was in the Air Force, I became a rabid evangelical. Thank God, left that when I came out, and was in Congregationalism through the UCC, and then once I was ordained, came into the UUA. So I've been all over the place, and I love where I am today. I primarily because of where I've been. It's kind of like that. I'm really excited about Unitarian Universalism because of all the spaces I've been. Like I said, in Christendom, Unitarian Universalism, I think as a faith, as a theology, as a community, lives into who I am. I want to begin with a quote, one of my favorites by James Baldwin, and it's at the bottom of my signature block on all of my emails, and it says here, "It took many years of vomiting up the filth I thought I was taught about myself. It took many years of vomiting up the filth I was taught about myself and halfway believed before I could walk around this earth like I had a right to be here." And what I love about that quote, it's not one of the most popular ones, but what I love about that quote is the part about having the right to be here. And in my experience, and a lot of queer people of color's experience, we've done a lot of wandering. My roots, my blood is Christian, it's Jesus, it's church, and we've done a lot of wandering. And so by the time we get to Unitarian Universalism, It's time to rest. It ought to be time to relax. It ought to be time to just like live and breathe a sigh of relief. There's been so many battles that were fought and won for many of us who get to a faith such as Unitarian Universalism, which is why welcoming is so key, not just to the LGBTQ program, but to all of our programs, and ought to be really at the root of so much of the work that we do, because there just isn't a lot of in faith spaces and religious spaces and theology, there's just not it's not common that there's a theology rooted and grounded in economic justice, climate justice, racial justice. They're usually like, on the outskirts of whatever it is that you're doing around theology, around, like the Trinity, or around, the person of Christ, or around, whatever your creed is or what have you, but they're not centered in your creed. And what I love about Unitarian Universalism is so much of what people are looking for and talking about and debating in society, so much of what was debated this week is grounded in our theology. It is something that is a part of who we are. And that's not rare. And so as a person of color, when I come into a faith like Unitarian Universalism, I get really, really excited, because it's like, these are the people I've been looking for all of my life. So I bring this up because as we talk about and think about justice, particularly centered in lived identity and experience, it is so important to remember that. So I want to talk a little bit about what I do very, very briefly, and then about the trans community. I'm just going to say it, and how and where we're at, where we stand with the trans community, based on a report that was a report that came out of a survey that was released a couple of years ago that's still very much alive today. 2 years is like a day, right? It's like, and then I want to get real practical and talk about our new Welcome Renewal program. And I'll just kind of like, it's going to like basically show you how to be welcoming, right? Because I think that while we're figuring out what we're doing and what we're being, it's important to also get to work. And so this is one way we can get to work. As the LGBTQ Multicultural Programs Director, most of what I do is Welcoming Congregations program, which was established in 1990. The Welcoming Congregations program was extremely popular as the gay rights movement back in 1990, as the gay rights movement grew, and as the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and in the wake of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. In response, many liberal mainline denominations and congregations became more eager to provide pastoral care and grief support to relatives and friends of those who were dying. Unitarian Universalism and many other faiths provided an effective response to the existential questions of LGBTQ experience. Like, what does it mean to be gay? What does God think about it? Why is this happening to us? And why is this happening to them? To particular questions that were prevalent around the time, and what were the causes and conditions of the virus. And so in the wake of that time, congregations were really, really eager to become welcoming congregations. And I also want to name that a lot of this work of LGBTQ welcome and inclusion was pioneered primarily by trans UUs, just as Stonewall happened with Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Our Welcoming Congregation program, our LGBTQ welcome and inclusion, was pioneered by the Reverend Barb Grieve, Alex Capitan, Sean Parker Dennison, folks who were marginalized even within the LGBTQ community, and made a space for all of us to be welcomed and included, who vying for their own personal identities to be respected and affirmed, develop programs and resources for all queer. I mean, I wasn't even out. I wasn't even out, and I'm gonna say I wasn't even out of high school in 1990, and and so this work preceded me far, long before I ever knew that I would be doing this work. So I just want to give some respect to them for doing that work. So while we're talking about welcome and inclusion, I want to begin by talking a little bit about the report on a survey that was done a couple of years ago. So how welcoming are we? Many UU congregations participate in the Welcoming Congregations program and consider themselves LGBTQ inclusive. But it may be surprising that for cis congregates to discover that only 72% of trans UUs, or 72% of trans UUs reported feeling not included or not welcomed in their congregation. And 42% of trans UUs regularly experience marginalization in UU spaces. Non-binary folks make up a majority of all folks who identify as trans, and they feel even less included and marginalized. And it's even worse when trans identity intersects with marginalized identities such as race, ability, and class. The results are even starker. Only 15% of trans people of color and 12% of disabled and non-binary trans people feel that they are completely included in congregations. Trans UUs trend slightly more racially diverse than UUs generally, and I actually think this is true of all queer people, or at least when you view it as like people of color in our congregations, most of us are queer. And that has to do with many of us coming out of faiths that are not queer inclusive. And so by the time we get here, our race seems to be affirmed and we're able to also have our queerness, we're ready to stay. So all that to say that like our trans community and trans and non-binary community are just not welcomed don't feel welcomed in our spaces. And many of us pride ourselves in being LGBTQ inclusive. So I'm gonna drop some links in the chat about this so that you can see the report for yourself and read through it and digest it so that you can understand what it's like. But these results show that UU still have a ways to go in being a fully welcoming faith. Trust has a few solutions for that. Trust is our group of trans religious UUs together. It's basically our religious professionals group who did this report and came up with solutions. So I'll drop all of that in the chat. You don't have to look for it now and I won't report them all now. But the Welcoming Congregations program is one way to begin helping with trans inclusion. And that's what we're going to talk about here in a moment. So the Welcoming Congregation, today we have about 800 Welcoming Congregations, most of which have not revisited their program, their welcoming program since originally being certified. And as a faith, there is a perception that just because we do not explicitly condemn homosexuality or trans identities, that we are welcoming. But being welcome is so much more than just a one and done program that you ran in like 1995 or a race program that you ran in like 1972. Like we have to continually be doing the work. Unfortunately, this only becomes apparent when there's harm. A trans person is fired, or someone wants to ungender the bathrooms, or some kind of a harm happens, then we realize that we really haven't thought about this or really haven't done the work for several years. Other issues are also left out of our LGBTQ programming, like intersex, asexuality, the phrase queerness and what it means today. Bisexuality is completely invisible, and as I mentioned before, not what it means to be non-binary. Since my tenure, I've focused mostly on renewing welcoming congregations via a program that we started called the 5 Practices of Welcome Renewal. And our hopes with the 5 Practices of Welcome Renewal is to create a way that congregations can continually be engaging, well, I guess really engaging ourselves or in yourselves around what it means to be welcoming in an intersectional way. So rather than, just saying, hey, we want to become a welcoming congregation, doing whatever work is required to do that, sending it into the UUA and then getting like a stamp of approval, and then just hanging a flag for the rest of your existence. We think that this work should be something that you practice, something that you revisit, and not in like heavy lifts, not like you're gonna do a complete analysis and dissertation on your congregation every year, because Unitarian Universalism is a small faith, but with big hopes and dreams. This year there's race, next year, there's climate, another year, there'll be economic, there's always something. So we get tired really, really quick. So the 5 practices of welcome renewal is a very simple way, but yet simple yet deep and engaging way for congregations to practice this work over and over and over again. So the 5 practices of welcome are: number 1, become a welcoming congregation. Matter of fact, this is time for me to share the screen. So the 5 practices of welcome renewal is: become a welcoming congregation, offer welcoming worship services, welcoming days of observance, welcoming religious education, and support a welcoming project. So these are things that congregations are mostly doing when we talk about, are you a welcoming congregation, or should you become a welcoming congregation? Congregations also often respond like, aren't we welcoming already? Don't we do this work already? So what we're doing is not forcing congregations to do a whole lot of work all over again, but really allowing you to receive some type of recognition for the work you're already doing, as well as being accountable as the UUA with providing you with programming to support being welcoming and welcoming trans and queer folks. So becoming a welcoming congregation is the expectation of every Unitarian Universalist congregation. Well over 800 congregations are currently approved as welcoming. Nearly 300 congregations are still being encouraged to fulfill those objectives. The second practice of welcome is welcoming worship services. Congregations incorporating welcoming worship services into your ordinary calendar of worship every year. These services might occur during LGBTQ Pride Month or any other day of observance. What happens is when someone comes into your congregation as a queer person, oftentimes they have to remind us to do this work. And having a program already in place to do the work prevents us from having to be taught how to do the work by people who are new to our community. Welcoming days of observance. We encourage congregations to practice the days and months and years that are important to the LGBTQ community. These look like Lesbian Visibility Day, Day of Silence, Pulse Day of Remembrance. If these days become a part of our days, it's like MLK, Indigenous Peoples Day, all these other days, folks will feel more connected, more engaged. Again, it may not seem like these are a big deal, but they are. Again, what it shows is that when folks come into our spaces who are queer, they don't have to teach us or show us how to welcome them. We're already prepared. My favorite part of the program is welcoming religious education. What this involves is being sure to incorporate a religious education experience into your liturgy throughout the year, every year. And this might look like hosting, showing a video that we sponsor, or reaching out to Transforming Hearts Collective and applying their trans inclusion in congregations, or engaging in activism. These are all ways that we encourage you to basically be educating yourselves around what it is that the congregation needs. One of the reasons that our welcoming congregation has faltered is because the UUA hasn't been really good at featuring programming that is up to date and current and keeping you up to date on most issues. So one of the things that we have committed to doing is producing a webinar every year around the current issues to keep the congregation engaged. And finally, Unitarian Universalism tries to do everything, as I mentioned before, but we can't. As there are congregations that are in remote regions that don't have an LGBT community and may not have. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing this work, right? Because people from that congregation may move to another congregation, or you may have someone coming. Again, once someone get to our congregation who's new, it's already too late for us to begin to learn how to welcome them. So we encourage congregations to, if you are in a remote area or not in an urban center, to connect with congregations who are, to connect with organizations that are doing this work. So I won't go into the mechanics of how to technically renew, but I wanted to give you some practical idea of what we're doing to ensure that that queer and trans people are connected and in your congregation, and how to continue to be welcoming. Lastly, I just want to talk about why this work is important. As I mentioned, so many folks have gone through so much trauma in order to get to our congregations. And I think as Unitarian Universalists, we, assume that, hey, we're evolved, we privilege free thought. Not that you can believe whatever you believe, but certainly we're liberal. We're good liberal folks, and we love and welcome everybody. But that's not enough. Faith is tough. Life is tough, and faith is tough, particularly in this season of life that we're living in. And so it's so important for us to remember that our faith is not just a space for evolved liberals, but it is for people who've experienced deep harm. And we just want to make sure that we're not creating more harm whenever they get into our congregations. So thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. That was absolutely terrific. I am so pleased that you're able to be with us, and there'll be a Q&A session, which will start shortly, and I believe Sahar will be asking the questions to you, either jointly or individually. So I will turn it over to her.
Break.
Yeah, we have the 5-minute break now, or we could shift that till later. We just go right into it. So some of the questions that arose during the session was, for instance, for Reverend Smith, what interactions do you expect to promote with organizations like JUUstice Washington and with congregational life staff?
What actions do it's a conversation I'd be very interested to have with you all. As I was indicating, and hopefully was coming across in the presentation, in my mind, some of the background work that we're doing as regional staff is actually helping create the platform for some of the other activities to happen on. And being that we have a staff of 10 full-time staff and 1 part-time staff person that's working a region that's the biggest one in the country, including all of Alaska and Hawaii, over 4 different time zones, 184 congregations, dozens of covenanting communities that are smaller than congregations, but nonetheless organized as Unitarian Universalist. There's a lot of ways and directions that we could point our energy into. And so what I'm most interested in is hearing some of the ideas that this group has about possible connections and collaborations between the region and and JUUstice Washington. Yeah, I would like to start the conversation there. And you know much more about like what you've got going on and what you see as potential possibilities than what I would. So I would like to acknowledge my newness and be open to that.
My next question is to the entire panel. And it's from a father of a young Black woman. And they're both liberals. They feel that oftentimes there's an expectation to be more radical. And there's a pressure, especially given all the controversies. And so is the understanding that all perspectives are welcome. And can you talk about the place that liberals have in UU racial justice work?
May I take this, or can I start and then you guys, because here's the thing about that, and I'm going to quote the Reverend Meg Barnhouse, who's a leader in Texas of a large congregation. I believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, not every idea. So this whole notion of all perspectives are welcome, what are we talking about? The perspective that it's okay to cage babies is not welcome. There is nothing about that perspective that has any place in a faith that says every person has inherent worth and dignity, okay? So because what it does is not only is it minimization, we're going back to color blindness. Well, we're all entitled to our opinion, and there's memes now. Well, that's true about ice cream, not about liberation, not about who is okay to be murdered. Breonna Taylor was murdered in her bed. We live in a society, and then we were told that is that they were doing their job. So we have a police force whose job is to murder Black people with impunity. So what opinion am I supposed to accept about that? So here's the thing. It is, UUs are so, we, some, because not me, are tentative about having boundaries around naming that we are going to take the side of those who are targeted. Period, full stop. I'm not halfway to a Nazi. This whole centering thing is nonsense, and we have to stop. Because again, the other side has a wide imagination of how many people we can kill and cage and subjugate and silence. Their imagination's endless. So we need to be firm in our values and not simply, and we can't worry about hurting people's feelings. People are being murdered in their bed for being Black, for being Indigenous. Standing Rock, we're trying to protect our water. So I feel very strongly, because I think we tend to want to be nice and not hurt each other's feelings, and people are dying. So this isn't, no, all views aren't welcome. You are not welcome to say that we need to be nice to Nazis and people who want to murder Black and brown people. I can affirm their inherent worth, but I also don't need to be nice to them and make sure their feelings aren't hurt.
Yeah, I'll go next. I think that neoliberalism has kind of created this entitlement to comfort, and really, like, a lot of people are looking for comfort. I mean, you know, and I think that the quote that I led by with James Baldwin sort of speaks to that. You know, like, most of the time, by the time we get to Unitarian Universalism, it's like you're so exhausted from whatever it was, fighting with your family to come out, trying to argue with people about race and whatever, like trying to figure out, like, you know, what hell is, whatever it is. Like, by the time you get here, there is this notion of like, oh, finally, gosh, I can sit down and just be, you know, and that's true. But I also think that, like, what's radical though is this idea, this entitlement to comfort, and this illusion that privilege is the norm. And so, like, that's radical. Like, what most people are experiencing in the world is not the radical comfort that we experience, the radical space that we get to do and be who we are. Like, that's radical. I think really, like, subverting what radical is versus just like is really what's important. And then the history of our faith is one of like of protest, you know, and progress, and those things don't come just because you just kind of, like, you know, light the chalice. They come through fight and blood and sweat and tears. And I remember, and I'll close with this, I remember James Cone, when I was at Union, said, you know, I think we were in a systematic theology class, and he said, or someone said, well, you know, like what if I die, you know, like, doing this work? And his response is like, you're gonna die anyway, right? Like, if you don't storm the gates and dismantle the oppressors. Like, they're coming for you. And so, like, why not get out there and do the work and find joy in doing it rather than being forced into a circumstance and a lifestyle that is not normal to us or that is not natural to us. And so yeah, I think it's about expanding the idea of what is radical and what's not.
I think we got some fine responses to that one. I have nothing to add. Appreciate my colleagues.
Perfect. So then another question is, can you just speak to a few concrete strategies that you find really effective in racial justice work that might be just open suggestions that other people could jump into beyond what you've already mentioned in your panels?
So we already know how to do this. Unitarian Universalists helped genuinely lead the way to marriage equality. This denomination was one of the national leaders to make that happen. So how did that happen? There was a lot of activism on the ground. There was letter writing and people making it a point, congregations, ministers, religious leaders, to organize. So we know how to, this is not foreign to us. No, advocating and community organizing isn't foreign. So, or we know how to do it. I don't even think there's even a magic bullet. I think what we need to do is center the work, is not how, so what stops us, what slows us down is the what Nancy McDonald called the fake fights in our congregation. How many hundreds of hours did I spend arguing about the words white supremacy culture? What? Instead of how do we organize and make sure that we have elected officials who aren't going to pass heinous laws? How are we, I mean, folks here especially talk about preaching to the choir. You all, I've seen many of you, I mean, I'm in the PNWD who know, go to the detention center in Tacoma, or go to Olympia. I mean, you all know how to do this. What needs to stop happening are these, frankly, again, fake fights that put us in circles and serve only to stop us from organizing. So what I don't want to do is have this idea that somehow there's this magic thing that's in the ether that we don't know how to do. We know how to organize. We simply have to stop having fake fights.
So I appreciate what Aisha is saying. One of the things that actually I had a chance to talk with Aisha about this yesterday that I'm aware of is that I think different from the marriage equality debate, there's already like a level of bloodshed associated with the oppression of Black people that we're just not going to be able to get around. I mean, the Matthew Shepard case was kind of like an anomaly. You just don't. I mean, with the exception of I'd say Black trans women who are still Black people, right? We're back to the racialized thing, right? But people aren't being attacked physically and their lives aren't at risk for being white LGBTQ people in the same way that is real for Black people, regardless of gender identification, sexual orientation. It's not something that is the same level of risk. So I think what I would recommend is that we get accustomed with the idea of life being fragile and capable of being snuffed out at any time. And I think that's a big difference for those of us who identify as Black, Indigenous people of color, and those of us who don't, is that we, I'll make it personal, I recognize every day that, my likelihood of being snuffed out because I take a political stance is much greater than it might be for someone who doesn't have that identity and doesn't show up in the world that way. I think the other thing that we're going to have to look at too is letting go of the idea that this is some sort of quick fix, something that we're going to be able to do in a kind of expeditious way. This is, what we're up against is hundreds of years old. It's old as human history. If we're talking about prejudice against, groups that are outside of our tribe, but we're talking specifically about racism and genocide and capitalism and exploitation of laborers in the United States, which is older than the country itself. and acknowledging that we have to recognize that it's not that the victories that we like to see, that we like to feel good about, are not going to be accessible to us in the same way that they might be for other struggles that we participate in. So I think like acknowledging that, doing the hard work of building relationships. You know, a lot of times when we're talking about interacting and working for racial justice, a lot of us have to go like way outside of our circle of friends to be able to connect with people who are other people and other groups that are actually doing that work. Somehow we've got to be much more enmeshed in each other's lives. And that brings with it an element of risk and pain and sacrifice and effort that's different from what many of us are used to extending. So I offer all of that for whatever it's worth.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, going back to comfort, right? I think that, you know, it's so important for us to put ourselves in uncomfortable situations so that we can experience what Black people, people of color, Indigenous people, the stress and the trauma that we have to go through in order to survive. And a lot of that survival for me is not about like the rough and tumble. It's really like, for most of my life, I've spent so much time in white spaces, you know, trying to acclimate, trying to learn the language, trying to like be liked, be accepted, be hired, be educated. So many resources, so much time, so much again, trauma and stress, just trying to like ensure that my life was safe, only to then have to get here and then argue these things. If you like put the shoe on the other foot and think about how much communities of color have to go through in order to survive, by being around white people and tolerating white people and understanding white systems and speaking the language and dressing a certain way and thinking a certain way and all these things, like the little bit of effort I think that white people have to do to do race work can become a little bit more tolerable and understandable. And like just realizing that it is work and it is uncomfortable and we have to build relationships, and people of color are doing it all the time, even whenever we're not being asked to, we're doing this work. So being in relationship and being in community means joining us in the network.
So then more on strategy, how do congregations center BIPOC folks and take direction from them?
Give us responsibility over your worship.
So,
and like,
go ahead, Michael.
Go ahead, Aisha.
Well, I mean, here's the thing about that. So I mean, this has been since I'm going on 2 decades being a UU, this idea of getting more Black and brown people into our congregation. What does Janice Marie Johnson say? It's not about browning the pews. But what does that mean? I mean, what can you do? Well, show up differently, because if you're wanting Black and brown people around you to make yourself feel better, we know that it takes it, you know, we'll know. And I don't know any Black and brown person who just wants to be an accessory to you or to a UU congregation or UU space. So what are the spiritual needs of the people for whom you want to be in community with? So the question itself is a bit loaded, and it's not, there is no one answer. It's about who do Unitarian Universalists want to be as a people? So here's what I know. If I walk into a congregation and I go to a social justice event and somebody asks the question, are all views welcome? And what about logic and reason? Well, then I think that Black and brown lives don't really matter to that group of people. If the answer is, oh yeah, we need to welcome all views because we don't want to offend anyone, well, I'm not going back to that congregation, because there's no center. There's no centering of human life or human value. So what does it mean to actually say in a response to a question like that? Well, we center human life and community and care for each other and care for the earth. So that means we can't just be okay with every idea or every opinion. And I also want to say Unitarian Universalism does not have a clean history. At one point, we had Unitarians very much into eugenics. So we're not clean. We don't, I mean, sure, there were periods of time where, we had Clara Barton and the Red Cross, and we have great folks throughout different parts of our history, but it's also not, it's not without its, well, we weren't always on the right side of history. And that's important to know too. So how do we make, I think learning how to decenter Eurocentric values is one way, because when this space, when people are informed and understand that what kind of action needs to happen right now, and frankly, the what we're up against, and be realistic about it, that's going to be a space that's more welcoming. So there's no, sure, you could put Black people in your board, you could hire Black and brown people, but if you don't listen to them, because one of the things that happened with me is, absolutely, you could criticize me being a religious educator, but when you start questioning why I'm here and my hidden agenda, you only need to go to Facebook to know what my agenda is. It's not hidden. So then that's the part that's that wears you down, like water on a rock. Like, I don't need, what are you suspicious of? What do you think I'm going to do? And that's the part that is not welcoming, or like, that's the part that's difficult. So there's no easy answer. Carlton said that, Michael said that, you're not going to come away from this summit like, okay, I have the recipe now to fix the congregation and have more Black and brown people. That's not a thing. It's going to take work, and it's going to take expanding your imagination of how bad things can get, so we can kind of exercise our resilience muscle and resistance muscles.
Underscoring everything that Aisha and Michael have said. Where to start? As others have said, racism in the United States is so much a part of what it means to be American, that when you go against racism, people see that as being anti-American. That's how deep it is. It's not like it is the water that we're swimming in. It's like racism is actually America. I mean, if you really just boil it like all the way down. There's just, so many ways that shows up and manifests itself. I'm just thinking, what it takes for a person of color to even go on the website of a Unitarian Universalist congregation, or to show up, if we were meeting in person, to show up on a Sunday morning and navigate that. It takes a lot. It takes a lot, or much less, to come out of like a person of color, a BIPOC community, into a Unitarian Universalist community that is more than likely overwhelmingly white. It takes a lot. And I think part of what the difference is going to be is just acknowledging that Unitarian Universalist is as much an ethnic religious community as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, as the Greek Orthodox Church. It's just that's how solidly bound it is into what it means to be white. And I've said it for years now that actually whiteness is the super glue that holds Unitarian Universalism together. And if you remove whiteness from the center, when you've got all of this diversity of opinions, all this diversity of religious background, if you take out NPR and free trade coffee and these other touchstones that we have, it's like what do you have left? And that's why it's so threatening. That's why people feel like they're backed into a corner and having to come out swinging. So yeah, so I'm just saying it's deep, and it's not going to be a quick fix. It's like what we're having to do with the country. We're on the front end of this, like we were on the front end of, civil rights movement and women's right to vote and that sort of thing. It's so deep that we're basically going to have to break the country all the way down to build it back up. That's where we are. That's the great turning we're talking about.
Yeah, and I, I was half joking, but not really. I mean, I think that like people, it's not like people of color fall out of the sky and they don't have any kind of like context for church, or like or ecclesiology, or like most of us, the Black church, speaking, the Black experience, the Black church is like the bedrock of the Black community, and so we know, like naming what Carlton named, like it takes a lot of energy to navigate all that stuff, because we know how it ought to be, like, or where certain things are. We know, the run of show, if you will, and how it's very dissonant right away. And so you're constantly, I know for me, I'm constantly having to remind myself when I'm in a white church, which is every Sunday, like, why am I here? Oh, I'm here for that one thing, this one thing, like the queerness, or or whatever it is basically that. And so like and all the other stuff you're constantly like cringing against. And I think really, really simple, like centering people of color means for me like making less cringeworthy moments in my experience. And I don't think that's asking too much. Because it's not reinventing the wheel. A lot of this stuff is just being hospitable to people who are different.
Okay, Aisha, a question for you is, what type of contingency planning for sheltering would you recommend? Is there a set of guidelines for such planning?
I would look to organizers, especially, so community organizers, and I will send John, I'll look up some of the, who's doing it the best, but there are organizers who have plans for how to, deal with law enforcement and be sanctuary congregations. There's already a few of our congregations that have been sanctuary, and and I know that's specifically for sheltering undocumented people, but I think some of those tips and best practices can also serve. I would also actually reach out to Louisville, their social justice folks. I'd reach out to Charlottesville because they also went through, Carlton was there. So I think reach out to people who've already been through this. There has been organizing against oppression since 1619. So there's a fallacy that somehow there's been uprising recently, but there's been nobody wants to be held in a chain or caged. So there are activists. I would look at successful activist groups. Like I said, I'll look up some, and I'll ask Carlton too, the ones that he knows, and Michael shared some resources. UUSC has some really good resources. The UU the Vote, Standing on the Side of Siding with Love campaign also has resources. And I would look to congregations that there's a handful that are doing it. And again, there's a lot we can do. We just have to want to do it, and not and really give pastoral care to the people who are afraid. So as part of the CLF, we sent out an announcement yesterday, Christina Rivera and Reverend Michael Tino and I, about how much we're going to restructure the CLF and have more resources to prison ministry. And there were we had a couple of people that are like, wait, what about us free world folks? And I'm like, so the fear is that somehow there's only a finite enough amount of spiritual sustenance, or there's a finite amount of love, or there's a scarcity mentality. So we're a candle, right? We light the chalice. When you light other candles from that chalice, the flame doesn't become less. There is just as much flame, right? And so we need to have that attitude of abundance and have spiritual generosity. We are not a generous people with our money or with our spirit. Let's become spiritually generous and faithful, and know that we could do the hard thing and give each other pastoral care. Yes, meet people where they are, but put our arms around them gently with masks on and move them across the street so we can move forward.
So as our time is getting short, I would just like to end with a note to maybe speaking about radical love. If you could just speak a little bit to this principle.
Well, yes, and I would say that that is what keeps me inside of Unitarian Universalism, because even though the 7 principles don't mention radical love explicitly, I feel like it is the foundation upon which those 7 principles are based. And from my perspective, it is like the biggest hope that we have. But that radical love, if we take it all the way back to, our Judeo-Christian roots as Unitarian Universalists, it would be something along the lines of what, as it says, in the Gospels, greater love hath no person than this, that they lay down their life for a friend. So at the point that we are willing to make ultimate sacrifices and understand ourselves in the larger context of all of humankind, and perhaps our life having to be laid down for the advancement of humankind, or even our institutions. I mean, some of us, worship, Unitarian Universalism, but what if Unitarian Universalism at some point has to disappear so that the next, manifestation rises up? I mean, I'm not closed off to that possibility either, but acknowledging that there's a depth to that radical love that, again, we're back out of our comfort zone. You can't talk about radical love and stay inside your comfort zone. So I lift that up, and the examples of Dr. King and Vernon Damer and so many others who literally lost their lives trying to help us advance. And where would we be had they not done that?
And radical love is not Unitarian Universalist. That to me, radical love is rooted in our connection to each other. When we forget we're connected to each other, like I wish our first principle was the interdependent web of life. I feel like we take too long to get there, and because radical love is not being okay with homeless people, having people without homes, without health care. I have a neighbor who wanted me to come over, who reads my Facebook page and talk about race. And she said, well, I think and she's not UU. She said, I think it's about class. I said, okay, then fix that. Let's get universal basic income and universal health care. You work on that and make it, that's radical love. I mean, radical love is not rooted in, Unitarian Universalism can be awesome. And it's not the be all and end all of existence. But if we center radical love, we have to remember we care for each other, for our planet, for the animals. And we don't cage people. Like universal basic income and universal health care. If we could start there, then we can have the conversation about dismantling mass incarceration and defunding the police and so on and so forth. So radical love is, what does Cornel West say? Love is what justice looks like in public. Or justice is what love looks, I think I screwed that up. Justice is what love looks like in public. Is that it?
Yes. So not my favorite term, right? Because like it's sort of redundant. I think love in of itself is radical. I don't know if it's necessary to put radical on, ahead of love. It just, like either you love people or you don't. And some people don't. And I think that, to have to like create degrees of love speaks to, again, like this kind of comfortable neoliberal do-gooder feeling that we all like, well, yeah, I love my dog and I love, like my children and my, and Netflix, so it speaks to a dampening of love that we constantly use as almost like a cliche around the things that we enjoy. Now if you want to talk about love that I don't enjoy, that's a whole nother thing. And so I think just, constantly, again, this term radical, because I think it creates a boogeyman out of something that ought to be normal, like all the things that Aisha just named ought to be normal. I mean, you just shouldn't have human beings like without a place to live. You just shouldn't have human beings in cages. You shouldn't have, like a government you know, an authoritarian government that wants to, you know, be in charge of certain people's bodies. Like these things are not, you know, like those are radical. Like those behaviors are radical. Like, to like completely, dismiss an entire population of people because of the pleasures they enjoy without knowing anything else about them is radical. Like, so we need to like not normalize or at least fetishize radical acts of love. Loving is radical in and of itself. And so if we can just normalize radical behaviors, then they will become the norm over time. And if not with our generation, then the next.
Thank you guys so much for answering all of those questions. And now is the portion of our summit where we will transition into breakout rooms. So I'm just going to read the charge. Anticipate a little bit of shifting once you get in there. As was mentioned earlier, you will be able to unmute yourselves when you enter. So of course we are here today because this matters. You've just heard from the panel, and some panel members may be in your group. And there's this energy in your group around this issue, of course. So based upon the presentations and the Q&A, your breakout group will draw from the energy in your circle to summarize the aspects of the issue that are most important to them. Is there a consensus about a way forward? What does your group suggest we work toward for instance, our December action-oriented part 2 of this 2020 summit? The facilitator will hopefully scribe, or someone else will keep a record to be posted in the main chat when you re-enter. Yeah, so guide introductions, take about 10 seconds for your name, where you're from, and then assist with the flow of the conversation around the group's collective interests and bring it to a close at the appointed time. If you would just take a second and we will send you in. So as mentioned, anybody who was scribing, taking notes on what was brainstormed in your breakout sessions, if they could just share a little bit in the chat about what you guys came up with, that would be really great. So I'm just going to share a little bit of what's coming up in the chats, just in case everyone's not seeing it. And I know some have a hard time managing the chat as we are face-to-face with one another. Some of the ideas that came up was that comfort is a continuum, and to start to consider this question of comfort for whom. And of course, there are so many actions we can take individually to share with what we have learned, like hosting Netflix COVID movie watching over Zoom screen share with friends. And also underlined was the panel's incentive that we have to stand up for who we are truly. And Maria mentioned that, as Aisha said, that we should not always accept opinions. We can cherish the person, but not always their opinions. Immigrant issues need our attention. Intersectionality between race and class must be discussed. Group 6 was really fired up about the firmness of a stance about moving toward action outside of the congregation, and about how important the historical and social context is, the importance of standing up now in more radical ways. The question, it's always really great to ask critical questions, and one of the ones that they brought forward is, are we recognizing people when they come into the church? And can we talk about this in a way that is not arguing? Can we help people see the big picture so that growth opens minds on both sides? Again, reiterating not to get too comfortable and practicing in our interactions outside of the congregation. Thinking of anti-racism outside of the church. Supporting I-940 on accountability of police. Being really clear and specific about our initiatives so that we can get more support. Acknowledging that Western-centric values are racist. Underlying that we're not asking everyone to subscribe to a vocabulary. So many issues are really intersectional. So alignment with honor, worth, and dignity of every person, not every idea. So support for the 8th principle project and commitment to assessing where we are at, alignment of need to go from study to action, which often gets shortchanged by the UU propensity to wordsmith and study to death. Alignment around asset mapping and leveraging UU resources. There isn't one pathway forward. Commit to it or not, find a way to express your love. Don't give in to discouragement. Keep going. Keep in mind future generations and that we're on the verge of something, movement or collapse. Turn to kindness and turn kindness into action as a way forward. Find existing organizations that are active with the issue you're interested in and volunteer to help out. Support the concept of expanded imagination, especially to include what's coming. The importance of keeping welcoming congregations a living, ongoing program, not just a one-time shot. Difficulty with action building in elderly congregations and trying to find that place that can encompass opposing viewpoints. Defining what we really mean when we say and what we represent. Really, really grateful for all of these wonderful resources. There's some education groups being pulled together, getting resources together, engaging in sometimes challenging ways, allowing BPOCs to lead, that it takes time. The suggestion to look up the organization Drum, build it into the spiritual practice and encompass empathy and humility, humanity-centered, get out of your head. I will just end there and hopefully hand this back to John.
I just want to again thank our speakers for being with us today. I just thought there was a lot of amazing thinking which went into the presentations, and I very much appreciate that. I again will remind people that we'll be gathering again in December to think about how to bring this work forward. There will be separate sessions on racial justice, so we'll invite you to come to that as well, and your registration for this event covers that as well. I think the next thing that we'll be going to is simply to hope that everyone has a chance to actually sit back and think about what you've experienced during this panel, and that will inspire you as we go forward with these issues. So I think
You
that's
have break,
yep, break.
and the next panel after the break is going to be environmental justice.
Yep.
So we encourage you to come back.
Yep. Thanks again.
See you shortly.